So I'll keep this pretty brief. I don't think too many people care what I have to say about video games. I do this every year, and I used to write about video games every month, actually, but that got old. Every year I come up with reasons to refuel this habit and this hobby, and to start that out, I have to start out with what was most disappointing. And I think Elden Ring was this great game that I loved. It was definitely worthy of a lot of praise. It was something I played for over 400 hours beyond its release, and I beat the game about 5 times on the same character before I started that character on Shadow of the Erdtree, this latest DLC release, which is enormous and empty. And I'll keep it short and sweet. It was just kind of fucking boring when I was done with it. I think a lot of the boss fights were gimmicky and boring, and it just the final boss was cheap as shit, and they nerfed it, and then it was just as boring as the rest of it. So I wouldn't say that I have a problem with the DLC being part of Elden Ring, but I found all of it unnecessary, and it was fun to explore until I realized how empty it was. Dragon Age, the problems with Dragon Age were clear from the moment I saw the pictures of it, and then I heard the dialogue. That is just trash across the board. Um, Dragon's Dogma 2 wasn't a bad game. I love the first game. I played through it a couple of times. The pawn system is kind of annoying and all that. It's basically the same game as the first one. They just made it less interesting by iterating into an expansive game that is too big for those old ideas. And I got sick of playing it because, just like the first game, there's about 20 enemy types, and it only gets more boring from that point. I wanted to love Metal Slug Tactics. What a great idea is to bring that IP into a strategy game. I love turn-based strategy games in general, and that's usually what I play the most of. And you'd think that would work as a fan of like the old SNK arcades and all that in the late 80s and 90s, but that game kind of sucked. It was boring. It felt like it was tutorialized for mobile users. It was just not as good as it could have been, and the music really didn't capitalize on the feeling of Metal Slug as well as I wanted it to. Visions of Mana is basically a kid's game. I should have expected that. It was not worth buying. I played every game in the Secret of Mana sort of lineage, and this one is just rote and boring. It's a big world. It's empty. There's a lot of shit to collect. There's no real reward for any of it. The story is dead in the eyes, and it was just disappointing. The best remakes and remasters of the year. I think if you haven't played Persona 3 and you're interested in turn-based JRPGs, play Persona 3 Reload. It is the best version of the game beyond the PSP version, and I think that if you're a fan of Persona in general, that's the place to start to kind of get you into the more over the top extras of 4 and 5 if you haven't played those. Silent Hill is surprisingly good. It's a depressing game that was known for being depressing. I think that remaking it to the level that they did Dead Space, where they've made it a lot more convenient, doesn't really change what a crazy PS2 game it was, but it still made it a lot more fun to experience from a completely different perspective. Overall, they preserved the feeling and the acting and the awkwardness of the game in the sense that it's still completely depressing and nonsensical until you spend more time with it. So that's worth it if you're a fan of that kind of thing. Otherwise, the Dragon Quest III HD 2D remake is, I believe it's just an upscaling of the 3DS version, unless I'm completely wrong. They did a similar thing to Star Ocean Second Story more recently, and I loved that. So this was basically the same idea for a game that's been remade probably at least 10 or 15 times over the years. If you've never played Dragon Quest, good place to start, but I would probably go for 8 or 11. Romancing Saga 2 Revenge of the Seven is another JRPG. Sorry about that this year. This is probably the best known one in terms of the Super Nintendo era. It was the best selling, I believe, on the Super Famicom, and it's been fully remade and not 2D, but in full 3D. It is a fully modern JRPG. It is one of the best of the year, and it would be on my list, but I didn't finish it. If you can sit through and enjoy a Japanese RPG, good for you. I think this is one of the best ones of the year. So I'll get to the list here, and I'll try to be brief. UFO 50 is number 10 for me. It is a game where, it's 50 games, and it was a challenge to essentially sit down and play all of them, find the ones that I loved. There were so many great ones. I should have made a list to mention here, but a lot of it was really inspiring. Simple game design is an art, and I think that these people who made this game just did a fantastic job of keeping it simple, keeping it fun, and reminding me of when I started playing games, which is when the arcades began to find parity with the home consoles. So that was exciting for me, but also there was some old PC game stuff in there too, like point and click adventures and stuff like that that were really well designed and a lot of fun. Nine Souls is an addition to my obsession with Metroidvanias. This is just a particularly good one. It is a little bit anime looking, not really my thing, but it was satisfying in the sense that it was a Metroidvania with a lot of intricate mechanics, and it kind of it's the game I'd recommend to people if you enjoyed the Prince of Persia game, which I'll mention later on in the list. Black Myth Wukong was a game I didn't want to like. Nothing felt good about it. It felt like a cheap PC game when I started playing it, and a very limited move set. Tons of bosses. Essentially a boss rush with a couple of annoying enemies along the way, but then it kept going. And I think I spent probably 60 hours playing this game overall, and I hated a lot of that. There's a lot to complain about. I won't go on about it. It's still a good game. Knock on the Coffin Lid released this year, and I guess the way that it was marketed was Slay the Spire meets Darkest Dungeon. There is uh, a card-based battle system that gives you a random assortment of actions to take, but there's also full gear setups. You get gear from encounters. You get a lot of choice-based options out in the world, and you select different paths. It's essentially a roguelite that you kind of tell the story in waves, and eventually it takes a lot of experience to start making the right choices to progress and gain new characters and finish the story. I will get if you did not like Rise of the Ronin. It is another game built on the Neo 2 engine or the Neo engine that is attempting an open world Assassin's Creed style game where you are a samurai. And if you're a fan of Ghost of Tsushima, this game will not live up to that. It is not as good. It is not as fun. It is repetitive. It is a slog. But as someone who has finished over 10 Assassin's Creed games, this was a breeze and it was not a problem. So I had fun with it. And I get that it sucks, but I still had fun with it. That's all. Unicorn Overlord. I'm a huge fan of Vanillaware. I have been for a very long time. This is another one of those nostalgic art style kind of things, but also it's a great game in terms of something like anime Shining Force, turn-based strategy, but with automated elements. There's always something unique about each Vanillaware game, and I think that this is a good follow-up to what 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim did. Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown is mentioned here simply because it is great. It's a great game. It was very annoying to get into. I really hated the parry system. I think that the controls are just as annoying as Metroid Dreads were to start. It took me a long time to get into it. A lot of the platforming challenges I wouldn't want to repeat again, but it's still obviously one of the best games of the year. It's not just for the sake of another Metroidvania, but actually a very good one that it tries to be the best at what it does. And I think that it would be cool if they continued making games like this. Metaphor ReFantazio is up here because of its story. The gameplay is just Persona, and there have been plenty of other games in this stable of work that are just similar to that. But if you liked Persona 5 and you want a completely different story that is all about revolution and intrigue and Politico, and there's a lot of cool things happening in this game that even if you're not a fan of the Japanese RPG or you've been just not been into it for a long time, this is a game that is worth connecting with if you have the patience, again, for that type of game. Again, the JRPG stuff doesn't stop this year. Ys X Nordics is probably my most hyped game of the year. I've been such a fan of the last four games. I've gone all the way back to Ys 7 and Oath of Felghana in terms of re-experiencing all of the series, and this one was disappointing to start. For me, Monstrum Nox was a lot of fanfare. It was a lot of new things. It was a new setting, and I really got into that world. And it took me longer with this because I didn't like some of the characters as much to start. I didn't like some of the starting areas, and the mechanic wasn't as interesting as the previous game's mechanics. Once I got a hang of it, it is another Ys game. It has all the charm you'd expect. The music is not as good as the previous games, but it is still a gem like the rest of them have been. And I figured I'd put this up here on the list because I knew that it was only going to grow on me, and I knew I'd play it again. The number one game of the year, Stalker 2 Heart of Chernobyl, was pretty rough. I slogged through it, I got started, and I got invested. For me, this is like a better, more serious version of something like Fallout 3, where you get this enormous world to chip out, and you can go and just quest. Go out and quest, go out and do things in the world, and you never feel overpowered. There are unseen forces that can tear you apart at any moment, but as you investigate and become part of it, the gunplay gets a lot easier. The loot and quest mechanics are easier to get through, and the world explains what it is pretty quickly. But the way that the story develops, the amount of world that you have to go through, the amount of quests that you can do, this was just my nightly thing to do for months. It does what I wanted the last Metro game to do in terms of give me a sprawling world, but give me interesting areas and quests to go through. Now, it's an open world. It can't all be perfect and hand designed, but they did try, and you can tell that it might be janky and there might be shitty things about the game, but you still end up feeling powerful by the time you finish the game, and you can take it in a couple of different directions. I don't want to spoil anything because I think game is totally worth playing, and it will be a gem in the future. So check it out yourself.